For half a century, Emma of Normandy was at the very heart of English politics. She had the distinction of being married to two kings of England and the mother of another two. Her first husband was the utterly hopeless Athelred the Unready. Her second was the Dane Canute, whose father, Svein Forkbeard, had plagued Athelred's kingdom with his raids for years, and even briefly deposing Athelred. With Athelred, Emma had three children, including the future king Edward the Confessor. With Canute, she had another two, including Arthur Canute, who became King of England also in 1040, and a daughter named Gunhilda, who was Queen of Germany for a short time. Marrying Athelred in 1002, Emma watched on as her husband struggled desperately to protect his kingdom. The same year that he married Emma, Athelred ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, an ill-advised slaughter of Danes living in England. Among the victims were the sister and nephew of the Danish king, Svein Forkbeard. In revenge, Svein intensified his attacks on England, and in 1013, Athelred, Emma, and their children were forced into exile. Normandy, Emma's homeland, was a natural place of refuge, with her brother Richard the Duke there. Athelred sent Emma and his children to Normandy first, expecting them to be received by the Duke with warmth, but unsure of the reception he might have received. When word was sent back to England that Athelred was indeed welcome in Normandy, the king set sail from his own kingdom, unsure over whether he would rule over it ever again. Telling is the fact that Athelred's son Edmund, from his first marriage to a woman named Algifu of York, remained in England. Edmund was made of tough stock, known to history as Edmund Ironside, and it would be he, rather than Athelred, who would resist the Danes with vigour over the next few years. On her landing in Normandy, Emma was greeted by Richard with great affection, which would have been welcome in these uncertain times, with her young children in tow. Despite Richard's soothing words, the future was equally uncertain for Athelred as it was for Emma. But in early February 1014, just weeks after landing in Normandy, luck seemed to change for Athelred when Svein Forkbeard died. The English nobles invited their exiled king to return, and Athelred would reign again until his death in April 1016. But in that time, it was Edmund who was emerging as a real figure of authority, and the Danes had also had a changing of the guard, with the equally talented Canute leading their ranks now. Svein Forkbeard, his father, was dead. And this new generation would tussle for the crown of England until the autumn of 1016, when the tide turned decisively in Canute's favour, with victory at the Battle of Ashenden and Edmund's death a few weeks later. Having established his authority as sole king of England, Canute now sought a new wife, disregarding his first, another woman called Algifu. He settled upon Emma. The encomium Emma Reginae, written, as you may have gathered, in honour of Emma, says, "This imperial bride was, in fact, found within the bounds of Gaul, and to be precise, in the Norman area, a lady of the greatest nobility and wealth, but yet the most distinguished of the women of her time, for delightful beauty and wisdom, inasmuch as she was a famous queen. In view of her distinguished qualities of this kind, she was much desired by King Canute, and especially because she derived her origin from a victorious people, who had appropriated for themselves part of Gaul." It may seem odd that Emma would marry a man who had, in part, been responsible for her and her family's exile, but the marriage represented an opportunity to, once again, become Queen of England, when a life of relative obscurity perhaps awaited her. Her children with Athelred remained on the continent. A daughter, Godgifu, was twice married, including to the Count of Boulogne, whilst two sons, Alfred and Edward the Confessor, potential rivals to Canute, would only return to England in 1036 with disastrous consequences. For 19 years, Canute ruled England with a combination of ruthlessness and a surprising amount of tact. For Emma, being queen to Canute would have been an altogether different experience from being the queen of Athelred. Athelred's reign was, of course, littered with chaos, whilst Canute brought a calm over the nation of England, which hadn't been seen for generations, perhaps dating back to the reign of Athelred's father, Edgar the Peaceful. That calm, however, would be broken with Canute's death in 1035, and Emma would have to play her part to ensure that hers and her family's future prospects weren't further harmed by the traumatic events of 1036. With Canute dead, his son from his first marriage, Harold Harefoot, took the crown, usurping Harthacnut, a son of Canute and Emma, in the process, much to Harthacnut's anger. And it was during Harefoot's reign that Edward and Alfred finally returned to England to visit their mother Emma, who was residing at Winchester. But the visit went terribly wrong. Edward and Alfred were ambushed by the men of Earl Godwin, acting on the king's orders. Edward and Alfred, with royal blood, were a clear threat to Harold, and the king wanted them dealt with. Edward escaped, but Alfred was killed. On the advice of Emma, Edward returned to exile in Normandy. For Emma, the death of Alfred was a terrible blow. The encomium Emma Reginae says this of her grief: for she was dazed beyond consolation with sorrow for her murdered son. And it wasn't just for the memory of Alfred that Emma was troubled. She was now gravely concerned for her position in the realm of England in the reign of the unscrupulous Harold Harefoot. Feeling it was not safe to reside in England, at least whilst Harold was king, Emma crossed the Channel to Flanders, where she stayed with Count Baldwin, who treated her with kindness. But a life in exile would not do for Emma. She'd been twice Queen of England. Why should she then accept the insults of Harold Harefoot, who had murdered Alfred and had wrongfully taken Harthacnut's crown? And so Emma made contact with Harthacnut in Denmark, and he would soon join his mother. In 1040, good news reached their ears. Harold Harefoot was dead, and what's more, the English would accept Harthacnut as their king. And so Harthacnut and Emma sailed for England and were gloriously received by the people, with the new king also sending for his half-brother Edward. Despite the trouble of the previous few years, Emma must now be content. One of her sons was on the throne of England, and the threat of the previous reign was now over. Although Harthacnut would only reign for 2 short years, Emma remained as Queen Mother, with Edward succeeding Harthacnut in 1042. But for Emma, the problems of her life weren't quite over. During the reign of Edward, Emma and her son Edward would have a falling out, and the king would strip his mother of her lands and property. However, Emma and Edward would eventually be reconciled. In 1052, Emma of Normandy died, 50 years after she had married Athelred the Unready. Her influence would last long after she was gone, with Edward playing such a vital role in the monumental events of 1066. During a visit to Winchester Cathedral in 2025, I had a very surreal experience, one I certainly was not expecting, nor will I forget. On display in a cabinet were the remains of a woman believed to have been Emma of Normandy herself. It is a very odd thought that I was in the presence of this most royal woman.